Hey, welcome back everybody. Chris Nichols here with PetaPixel, coming to you from the beautiful Kananaskis area here in Alberta. And look at this, we now have ourselves a full production Nikon Z6 III. We did do an initial impression video. We covered a lot of topics there. You'll definitely want to check that out. But now that we have a full production unit, we can do a final review and we have some very interesting findings to share with you. Now today I'm also going to be talking about my opinions of this brand new camera compared to the older Canon EOS R6 Mark II and the Sony a7 IV. And if after this review you decide you'd rather have the Canon or the Sony, we've got the place for you to get those cameras used. You want to go to Cage.com because Cage.com has the best pricing on used gear that you know is going to be checked over by their qualified technicians, going to be in perfect working order, and will give you a 180-day warranty. You get the peace of mind of first off not having to buy from some private seller in some shady parking lot, but also knowing that they're going to grade the cameras according to their quality and condition, so you know exactly what to expect when you get your camera. And if you're still not happy with your purchase, if you're having buyer's remorse, they have a very generous return policy. Cage.com is the best place to get your used gear, and that's why it's PetaPixel's official pre-owned gear partner. So during our initial impressions video in Portland, Oregon, we had a lovely time. We really got to get a lot of the handling, controls, and general technical specs out of the way on the Z6 III here. So you'll definitely want to check that out. But there were some things we absolutely could not test. So first off, we weren't able to process RAWs. Now we have production camera with RAW support. And so this is where we can really look at things like dynamic range and image quality. That was a big question. Jordan also took one for the team and took the Z6 III out to shoot a baseball game. So we got some good autofocusing tests, even in lower light situations. So that's also going to be something we want to cover today, and a lot more. So one of the things we like to do when we come out to beautiful country like this is do some landscape shots. And the Z6 III, I think, is going to find itself to be a very versatile camera, suited for people shooting all kinds of stuff, including landscape or sunlit scenes, outdoor sports, all these situations where dynamic range becomes very important. But now we do have a camera that we can test, and because it's a partially stacked sensor, and we've never seen that before, we're very curious what to do to DR. We have had some very interesting findings. So dynamic range is roughly the same whether you're using the mechanical or electronic shutter. Normally cameras take a hit when you go into electronic shutter mode. We're getting the exact same bit depth of the files regardless of what shutter we use, but we're also getting the exact same dynamic range. So the next thing we figured is this: fully stacked sensors with all the benefits they have for faster readout speeds do tend to take a hit when it comes to dynamic range. We've seen this on cameras like the Nikon Z8, for example. So we figured, okay, if this is a partially stacked sensor and we're getting all these other compromises to readout speed and burst rates, maybe we'll only take a minor hit to dynamic range with this particular sensor. But what we found here was actually quite the opposite. So to give you guys context, the Nikon Z8, you lose about third of a stop to half a stop of DR compared to a camera like the Z7 II sensor. With this camera though, compared to the Z6 sensor, we were losing actually a stop of dynamic range. And again, we can't get any of that back by going to mechanical shutter because we got the exact same result regardless of what shutter we use. So we're taking a serious hit here, which puts it on par really more with like an APS-C size censored camera. And so that's going to be a real consideration for somebody who wants to shoot high dynamic range, high contrast, bright scenes with dark shadows. You are going to suffer a bit here. I should point out though that this hit really happens at the lower ISOs, although frankly that is where you're going to use them the most. If you look at the charts here from Bill Claff at Photons to Photos, you can see that from about 800 ISO up, the sensor is actually very competitive with other sensors in its same group. I mean, you're going to get basically the same dynamic range, same kind of low light performance, noise levels. It's really when you're shooting the lower ISOs where you often shoot landscape and stuff that you are going to see that hit. So look, not every every photo situation is going to need the most dynamic range possible. But you know, we ragged on the Sony A9 III's global shutter for having a big hit like this, so we have to do it here as well. When we look at the competition, first let's take a look at the Canon R6 Mark II. So that camera does have an electronic shutter mode where it drops the bit depth to get a faster burst rate. So compared to this camera, this is actually better in electronic shutter mode or mechanical, again, doesn't make a difference, than the R6 II is in electronic shutter mode. But go to the mechanical shutter where you don't drop the bit rate, and the Canon does now have an improvement over this. What about compared to the Sony A7 IV? Well, the A7 IV has a terrible electronic shutter because it maintains the bit depth, but you lose a lot of readout speed, so people don't use it. And if you then go to mechanical shutter, well, there's just no comparison. So this is really kind of at the bottom of the pack. It only beats the Canon R6 II in electronic shutter mode against a lower bit depth file. But you know, in a situation like this, we don't always want more dynamic range. Sometimes we want to even out the contrast. And so that's actually where this Westcott L60B is coming in really handy. First off, battery powered with the accessory handle. We can just bring it out with a lightweight tripod. We don't have to worry about big power banks and cables. It's fantastic. And I'm out here, we've got this light coming from the background, but the light on me is dappled and it's putting a leaf pattern on my face. So we're using the L60B to actually even that out, get rid of that sort of strange dappled light, but still match that sort of directional look that we're getting with the natural sunlight. Very convenient. We've used it for both portraits and now in this case for video, and that's why we love Westcott. They're PetaPixel's official lighting partner. And if you want to pick up a Westcott L60B of your own, click the link in the description below and visit fjwestcott.com to look at all their other products. So the Nikon Z6 III has the first partially stacked sensor that we've seen in a camera before, and we talked a bit in our first impressions of how this absolutely speeds up your burst rates and, you know, gives you a nice quiet shooting capability with fairly fast readout speeds using electronic shutter. But this camera does still have a mechanical shutter as well, and an interesting phenomenon takes place. It's a little bit confusing, that's why we're talking about it now. If you choose to use your mechanical shutter with this camera and certain lenses, the 24-120 f4 is a candidate, but mostly other telephotos. We have the 400mm, it does it with that. The other telephoto lenses as well. The camera will not give you direct access to choose mechanical shutter only. And that seems strange. What Nikon's choosing to do here is actually give you the option to do either electronic only, electronic first curtain only, or you can choose auto. And if you choose auto, you will still get access to the mechanical shutter. It will use it anytime the shutter speed is faster than 1/320th of a second. But if the shutter speed has to go slower based on the light level, it will then automatically default to electronic first curtain. And what it's trying to do here is actually just minimize some of the shake, add stability, enhance the capabilities of getting a sharp picture with a long lens at slower shutter speeds. It is kind of weird to me that Nikon doesn't give you the choice to just force mechanical shutter, that they're absolutely forcing that I have to do a combination of the two based on the shutter speeds. So the Nikon Z6 III is not a bad little sports and action camera. I think a lot of people are going to appreciate it for that. And Jordan did go out and shoot some local baseball, the Okotoks Dogs, and actually the first pitch was thrown by famous Calgarian wrestler Bret the Hitman Hart. I mean, the most famous Calgarian wrestler of the legendary Hart family. DM Jordan if you have any questions about wrestling. He's a huge wrestling fan. He'll answer all your questions. Anyways, so I should point out that Jordan was shooting this game with autofocus continuous, excellent 3D tracking, which we love, people detect turned on, and he had the responsiveness set to delayed so that if a spectator or a player got in front of the person he was focusing on, it would delay refocusing and just kind of stick on that original subject, and that actually performed very well. Now, using electronic shutter mode does give you a bit of a boost, of course, but there are some rolling shutter issues. I mean, the readout speed's not bad. It's just over 1/60th of a second. That's pretty good, but you will still get rolling shutter issues when shooting sports and action. That's why it's so nice the mechanical shutter gives you that 14 frame per second burst. As well, I do want to point out, Jordan didn't notice any autofocusing performance benefits going to the electronic shutter, so more reason again to shoot mechanical shutter mode. So now let's talk about autofocus performance, because that's another big thing here. Nikon's been on a kick lately, doing really good autofocus performance. In a clear field of view, that 400mm f4.5, Jordan's hit rate was excellent. He was saying he was getting fantastic shots, eyes in focus, you know, fast movement, everything coming in and out of the frame, and it was doing a great job. So the only time we've really seen Nikon struggle with autofocus is if there is something in the way. So for example, the baseball game, Jordan had a chain link fence in front of him, he's shooting through it, but focus limiter turned on the lens, it shouldn't even be considering anything in that range, and still every once in a while it would just hiccup. It'd want to pull off the player and then almost immediately go back to it, it's not the end of the world, but it doesn't inspire confidence, and you might have some sequences and shots where you are losing that decisive moment. We've noticed this as well shooting things like the Nikon Z8 with snow in the way, or certainly if you had like a field of leaves in between you and your subject, or branches in between you and your bird. So just keep that in mind. Performance though for autofocus is still fantastic. When it came to low light shooting, Nikons do focus at incredibly low light. That's nice, but we did still find that sometimes with face and eye detect with moving subject in very low light situations, you might get nose focus instead of the eye.
All right, Jordan here to talk about the video capabilities on the Nikon Z6 III. And if you're looking to know like all the recording options and things like that, definitely check out our previous video where I go through a lot of that. But the main takeaways you need to know is it's just extremely impressive that we've got a full frame camera that can record over sampled 4K 60p at this price point. I've been using it a ton and the image quality is just fantastic on it. If you want to do additional slow-mo, this does have 4K 120p, but unfortunately it's no longer oversampled and requires a pretty heavy DX crop. It's fun to mess around with, but this is definitely the weakest quality that the camera is capable of. It is great that this gives you the ability to record ProRes RAW or Nikon's own proprietary NRAW. However, if you want to record 6K 60 frames per second, that's only available in NRAW. And remember, at this time, you're only editing that footage in DaVinci Resolve, so make sure that that's going to line up with your workflow. Now, when it comes to dynamic range on this, I was a little concerned because of what we were seeing in photo mode, but remember, this sensor can read out fast enough, it doesn't have to drop the bit depth. And what that means is the dynamic range is actually very competitive with other cameras in its class, like the S5 II, the Sony a7 IV. The big thing is I find the N-Log LUT for this camera is very aggressive. When you're using the view assist, it's going to look very contrasty, like you've blown your highlights or clipped your shadows. You really want to trust your waveform. Also, when you drop the same LUT on in post, you're going to see that same thing, just huge contrast, but the camera is recording a pretty wide dynamic range, so you'll be able to save all but the most extreme shots. So basically, dynamic range can be an issue in photo mode, not really so much in video mode. The other thing I really wanted to test is overheating on this camera because it doesn't have things like fans built on it, and it has some very demanding video record modes. So I started with the most demanding, which is 6K 60 RAW, and there I was able to record for 17 minutes before the camera shut off. Interestingly, the camera was cool. It was when I pulled the card out, it was scorching hot. So that SanDisk 256 gig card may have been the limiting factor in that situation. If we record the more reasonable RAW modes, so going down to the 24 and the 30, you can record for 42 minutes. Again, camera didn't get hot, but the card got extremely warm and it did shut it down. So if you need raw video recording for a long time, this isn't really ideal. If we switch over to H.265 10-bit recording, then if we use regular 4K 24p oversampled, I'm recording 2 hours, which is the record limit on this camera. It's very weird, it still has a record limit. Then when we're going to 4K 60p oversampled, I was getting 52 minutes. 4K 120p with the crop, I was getting 42 minutes. So this is a very good thermal performance for standard recording. It's just if you go to the high frame rates that it could be an issue for very long recordings. Now there is one image quality concern that I didn't see in my initial testing, but I have to thank Robert May for bringing this to our attention. But there is a concern if you're shooting at extremely high ISOs and looking at the shadows that they will actually flicker. And this is absolutely something I found that was repeatable. If I shot NRAW and brought it to 51,200 ISO, again, this is an extreme situation I would probably never do, but if you do, you're going to see flicker in the shadows, and this is something that you're not going to be able to clean up. It's not just a matter of doing noise reduction on it because the actual exposure is changing. If you shoot the camera at 6400 ISO, its second base ISO setting, you're still going to find a little bit of flickering in those shadows. So if you bring those shadows up, again, that's going to become a more prevalent issue. Now, this isn't something, again, that's going to affect much footage at all, but if you plan to record a ton in extreme low light with this camera, it is definitely a concern. What we don't know at this point is whether or not it's a firmware issue or it's something that the sensor is doing, so stay tuned. On the PetaPixel podcast, we're going to be talking about this more, and we're hoping to get a response from Nikon on exactly what the issue is here. So I've absolutely loved shooting multiple projects with the Nikon Z6 III. It's just an absolute pleasure to use. And if you look at other full frame cameras in this price range, I think this is definitely the best hybrid option if video is really important to you. If video is your main priority though, and you're willing to compromise on sensor size, don't forget the Panasonic GH7 is offering some really cool stuff like oversampled 4K 120, 32-bit float recording, but of course you're gonna have to compromise on the sensor size, and it's nowhere near as good a photo camera. So if you're looking for a true hybrid, I think the Z6 III is the best in class.
So you've had a good time with the Nikon Z6 III here, figure out the last little bits of information that we need to get to now compare it to its two closest competitors, the Canon EOS R6 Mark II and the Sony a7 IV. Now first against the Canon R6 Mark II, this does actually compare quite favorably. I mean, they both have excellent ergonomics, but I do really like the way this camera handles. I do also like the fact that the EVF here is at 5.76 million dot EVF, just a little bit better resolution than what we get out of the Canon. As well, the electronic shutter on the Canon does have some major downsides. Although it does give you that fast burst rate, you're losing dynamic range, and this is giving us a very respectable burst rate, getting better dynamic range than the Canon when shooting electronic shutter mode, and at least in mechanical where we take a hit, we are at least getting extra couple frames per second. So for sports and action, I would say this has a slight edge. Autofocus performance is great on both cameras, very similar, but this is the stronger video platform as well. So now against the Sony a7 IV, I mean, Nikon's done a lot to flesh out its full frame line of lenses. It still can't quite compete with Sony, but you do get a complete setup. And the Sony a7 IV, although a fantastic camera, is now starting to show its age. It's getting long in the tooth. As far as handling goes, I do far prefer the Nikon body. I just really like the controls here. The Sony, a little bit smaller, but not quite as ergonomic to use. This also, again, has that better EVF at the 5.76 million dot EVF, and this is a far better video camera than the Sony a7 IV. Now, when it comes to sports and action, I do still think that Sony's real-time tracking autofocus has an advantage over Canon and Nikon, but they're pretty close for a lot of situations. Again, we got a really good hit rate here, and this is a much faster shooting camera. The Sony in mechanical shutter mode can only do 6 frames per second if you're gonna get lossless RAWs, and if you're okay with compressed, lossy RAWs, well then it can only go up to 10. This still has the advantage. And the Sony a7 IV's electronic shutter mode, it's brutal. Too much rolling shutter to really rely on for sports or action or almost anything outside of still life. But the Sony does have a distinct advantage. It does have better dynamic range, and it's doing that all while giving you 33 megapixels. So if I was shooting things like landscape today, still life, architecture, I still think the Sony does give you an advantage. But as an overall versatile tool, the Nikon Z6 III actually holds up really well. Hope you guys, as always, enjoyed spending time with us here looking at the Nikon Z6 III. It is a very versatile camera, but it does have some quirks. So leave comments below. Let us know what you think about the system and whether that would be an issue for the kind of work that you do or any other thoughts you have. We always love to hear it. In fact, we like to talk about those thoughts on the PetaPixel podcast. You can listen to it on all your favorite just podcasting apps, anything you want while you're washing the dishes or driving in your car to go take photos. But you can also watch us on this exact same YouTube channel. Check out store.petapixel.com. That's where we have all of our fantastic merch. We'd appreciate your support there. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.